So this screencast is about an explanation for how the Americans were able to be the victorious group at the Treaty of Paris. When they signed the Treaty of Paris, it sealed that the Americans had won the war and the Americans were going to be independent. But going into that war, people would have viewed an American victory as really a strange idea. Everybody would have put their money on the British winning the war, and that's because going into the war before the Treaty of Paris is signed to signal that the war is over, the British had some major advantages. The first advantage was that they had more money than the United States did, or than the Americans did. The Americans were relatively poor compared to Britain, and the British had the strongest, wealthiest empire on the planet. The British also had more equipment in terms of things that you need to fight a war. They had more ships, they had more cannons, they had more rifles, they had more uniforms, they had more bandages for men who had been hurt. They had everything that they needed to fight a war, and the Americans had to find all that stuff. They didn't already have it on hand, and they didn't have a whole lot of money to buy those things. Perhaps more importantly, the British had more soldiers. They had the largest army in the world at the time, and that army had a lot of experience winning and fighting wars. They had actually just won a war against the French and the Spanish at the same time and had gained a lot of territory through it. The British military in 1775, when the American Revolution starts, is considered the strongest military on the planet. By the time the war is over in 1783, 1785, depending on who you talk to, and the Treaty of Paris is signed saying that the Americans have won, the British actually still have that same reputation despite losing this war. So why would the British lose the war if they have more money, they have more equipment, and more soldiers and more experience? Well, what we're going to look at today is the idea that the British had priorities that did not include the colonies. There were other things that the British were more concerned with protecting and defending and spending their soldiers and their money on than the American colonies. So that's kind of the idea here, is that the UK, the British didn't really think that America was important. One example of this, one really important example of this, is the Caribbean islands that they had captured from Spain and France during their most recent war. They had conquered basically the entire Caribbean, now belonged to the British, and this was important because most of Europe's sugar, almost 90% of Europe's sugar, came from the Caribbean islands. And sugar is something that people like to have. It makes everything taste better. So the Europeans are spending a lot of money on sugar that's coming from the Caribbean islands. But the Caribbean islands are not easy for the British to control. First of all, the plantations where the sugar cane is grown are worked on by slaves, and slaves, despite the fact that they don't actually have to be paid, they're pretty expensive because you have to have an armed force there to force the slaves to keep doing the work, because they don't do it, willingly. They'd rather do something else. So the slaves have to be kept in line. That can be expensive. France is consistently trying to steal islands or pick up new footholds in the Caribbean, and so the British are trying to fend the French off and keep the French out of their territory. And in addition to all of that, pirates, who sometimes are ex-slaves, sometimes are Spaniards, sometimes they're French, sometimes they're Dutch, sometimes they're actually Americans, sometimes they're actually British, are all working together to try and steal the ships that are being sailed from the Caribbean to England, because there's a lot of money on board those ships and a lot of things that they can sell on board those ships. So the pirates are trying to steal things, and so that means the British Navy has to have ships sailing all over the place in the Caribbean to make sure that their ships don't get lost. Johnny Depp and the Pirates of the Caribbean come to mind, obviously, but the British had this priority of protecting their moneymaker of the islands in the Caribbean that had sugar. Even more important than the Caribbean was India. India's most important colony was India, and that's because India was full of all sorts of minerals and other valuable materials that the British either needed to stay in power or that they needed to make money. Opium was an important medical drug at the time. Silk, indigo, which is a dye that turns things blue, cotton was growing much more in India than it was actually in the United States during this time period. There's a mineral called saltpeter that is basically used to make gunpowder and fireworks that was important for the British military to have easy access to, that was abundant in India. And then we've talked extensively already about the importance of tea in English culture or British culture, and how angry the colonists got about tea. Well, that tea, it's actually, first of all, the British didn't invent tea, the Indians did, and they're getting it all from India. All that tea comes from India. So the British are getting their tea from India. They're getting all their cotton. All sorts of other useful materials are coming from India. In other words, they're making a boatload of money on India. They're making money hand over fist in India. And on top of that, India is their link to the rest of Asia. They have colonies in China and in some of the islands south of China. They're making money on all of that, and India is a nice kind of central location. On your way to England, you stop in India, and even other countries stopped in India and paid for the right to stay in British harbors. So the most important thing to the British is to make sure that India is safe and they don't have to worry. In particular, the Russians wanted to control India, and the French were starting to encroach on that area. So the British have a huge military force in India. One, to make sure that the Indians keep working on in the farms that they're supposed to, or in the mines that they're supposed to, but also to make sure that the Russians and the French don't get any ideas about trying to take India away from the British. So the British are spending a lot of money and soldiers and time trying to protect both India and the Caribbean. So there's two things that very clearly the British want to protect and they care about, that they're trying to make sure they don't lose, that are very important to them, that they're making a lot of money on. At the same time, America is becoming kind of an expensive colony. In 150 years, the British have already fought 3 wars involving America that basically started because of their colonies in America. War's expensive. They didn't like that. Perhaps more importantly than that, though, America is expensive to keep, but it also doesn't really give the British anything they can't get anywhere else. The crops like tobacco and cotton and indigo and rice, they can get in the Caribbean, they can get in India. They don't really need any of the crops that they're getting from the colonies. At the same time, the manufacturing that was happening in places like Boston and New York, also, I mean, the English can get that stuff done better in London or Manchester or Liverpool, places that are already in England that have better manufacturing factories. They don't really need the colonies. So you get this combination of the American colonies are expensive to hold on to because of all the wars being fought. They don't really need anything that they're getting from the American colonies. And then you top that off with the colonies are being unruly. Even if they win the American Revolution, the British realize they're going to have to keep a bunch of soldiers in America to kind of force the Americans to do what they're told. And really what you end up with is you've got the Caribbean and the colony of India that are really important and make a lot of money for the British, but require some upkeep. And then you've got the American colonies, which require a ton of upkeep and don't really have any value. And so it's not the only reason that the British lose the American Revolution. The Americans used guerrilla tactics, which were very successful in helping them win the war. Not fighting the way the British wanted to fight. They used guerrilla tactics. That helped them. And being able to have multiple theaters of war where there were groups of battles taking place in the north and the south and the middle colonies, being able to spread out over multiple theaters of war also really helped the Americans. But for sure, one of the 3 most important reasons that the Americans won the war was that the British really didn't care. And so that's kind of what we're trying to convince you of here, is that one of the reasons that the Americans won the Revolutionary War is simply because the British didn't care enough to fight hard enough to win it. So that's the end of the notes. I'm going to log off here. It's going to take a minute, but you guys are done taking notes. Remember, we've got an open note quiz tomorrow at the beginning of class, so be prepared for that, and we'll see you tomorrow.